Salve, citizens, and welcome to part 3 of our section on Roman expansion and crisis. You know, when we last left the Republic, it was in a really rough state. Rome's growth, rapid expansion into an empire had caused political and social and economic problems that had the Republic on the verge of collapse. Unemployment ran rampant. The urban poor were filling up the cities as thousands and thousands of farmers had lost their lands and couldn't find jobs because slaves had taken all of the work that there was to be had. And the Roman government's response was tepid at best, placing a band-aid on an axe wound, if you will. Well, in today's session, we're going to meet several individuals who attempt to reform the system in Rome to try to fix Rome's economic and social problems. Among those that we're going to meet will first be two brothers, the Gracchus brothers, Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus, and we'll look at what reforms they proposed and attempted to make in Rome, and what was the ultimate fate of their reforms and each of the brothers. Then we'll move on to a very famous Roman statesman and general, a fellow by the name of Gaius Marius. We'll look at who he was, what reforms he attempted to make to address Rome's political and economic issues, and finally we'll analyze the long-term social and political impacts of Marius's reforms. These are going to be real game changers that will really alter the course of Roman history from this point forward. Thus, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's begin. So as Rome's economic and social crisis is ever deepening, we're going to see a string of politicians attempt to institute their own brand of reforms. The first of which will be Tiberius Gracchus, the older of the two brothers. Tiberius Gracchus was elected to the position of People's Tribune in 133 BC. Now, if we remember far enough back, originally the plebs had no personal representation in the Roman government. But by this time, the common people had their own body within the legislature called the Council of Tribes. And they then had the opportunity to elect someone to be their personal representative in the Senate. This position was People's Tribune, and that's the position that Tiberius Gracchus won in 133 BC. And this was a great position of an incredible amount of power, almost similar to the consuls, because the tribune could propose legislation and veto legislation on his own. So this is a really important position. So Tiberius Gracchus, as People's Tribune, proposes to help Rome's poor by limiting the size of the latifundias. You see, he reasons that the latifundias are really the cause of much of Rome's economic woes. It's the latifundias that have driven the small farmers out of work, which has led to the very high unemployment. So his plan is limiting the size of the latifundias, create a ceiling, a maximum size that any one individual could own when it came to latifundias. This then would hopefully prevent small farmers from being driven out of work. He then proposed taking the leftover land after you'd shrunk the size of the latifundias and simply giving it away to the poor. Now, as you would expect, the common people, especially the urban poor, were really on board with this idea. Obviously, they would be huge fans of Tiberius Gracchus. Of course, he wasn't loved by everyone. The Senate, for their part, many of whom had gained their wealth from the latifundias, was strongly opposed to Gracchus and his attempted reforms, because limiting the size of the latifundias could limit their wealth and in turn limit their power. The Senate was able to turn much of the city of Rome against Tiberius Gracchus by very deftly and probably untruthfully convincing people that Gracchus was merely pandering to the masses in order to gain enough power to make himself a king. Well, as it turns out, as today and back then, a lot of people are really gullible, and many of them bought it. Eventually what happened was, when Gracchus and a number of his supporters were walking through the forum, they were met by an angry, rioting mob. Mob violence ensued, there was street fighting, and in the process, Tiberius Gracchus was killed. Really, even though the Senate didn't do it themselves, blood was on their hands in this one. So he and his reforms are dead for the time being. Well, 10 years later, Tiberius's little brother Gaius runs for tribune and wins. And as People's Tribune, he proposes the exact same reforms as his older brother had done. He was met with a similar fate as once again actions of the Senate led to his murder. So we see the first couple of people who tried to make some reforms to the system end up in a rather messy fashion. Well, another reformer, so to speak, is Gaius Marius, a great Roman general and politician. Now, Marius was elected to the consulship in 107 BC, and at the time, Italy was facing a threat of a massive invasion of Germanic barbarians from outside the empire, from areas that Rome referred to as Gaul, that's present-day France, and Germania, that's everything beyond the Rhine River. Now, one of the things that we have to realize is that the standard for military service was land ownership. You had to own land to be able to serve in the military. And since so many people had lost their land, the number of those eligible to serve in the military had greatly decreased. And so now it was believed that the army did not have enough available soldiers to fight off this massive barbarian invasion. Well, Marius, as consul, proposes a number of changes to the Roman army in the hopes of fixing this problem. First, he introduces a number of new weapons and tactics that really kind of changes the formation and the standard practices of the Roman army, makes them an even more efficient and deadly fighting force. But most importantly, he makes a groundbreaking change to the Roman army in that he proposes changing the Roman army from a citizen army into a professional army. See, remember, in a citizen army, every single male citizen would serve when called upon. But in a professional army, it's not just any male citizen, but anyone could volunteer to serve in this army. And the Senate approved of this measure, desperate to fight off the Germanic barbarian invasions, and Rome now had its first professional armies. And so Marius begins to kill two birds with one stone, fix the military problem and address the unemployment problem, because he begins to recruit the poor and unemployed into the military. So this is providing them with jobs. And so now soldiers would be paid for their services. All those unemployed now would have jobs in the military. On top of that, part of your military service, because you were volunteering, was that once your time of service was up, you would be granted land by your commander after you were discharged. So it's really a pretty good deal if you think about it for those who are interested in getting involved. And as a result, the number of soldiers in the Roman army swells to a size that it never had before. And using this new professional army, much, much larger in size, Marius defeats the barbarian invaders and saves Rome. Really big deal. He's a hero of Rome. Everybody loves him. If his life would have ended right there, he'd go down in history as one of the greatest Romans. But his victory and his saving of Rome comes with a heavy long-term cost. Because you see, Rome's old army had always been a citizen army. And in the citizen army, the soldiers owed their allegiance to the republic, to the government, to the homeland in which they were serving and protecting and defending. They served not because they were being paid, but because they felt the duty to serve and defend and protect Rome. But now the legionnaires in Rome's professional army do not owe their allegiance to the republic. They do not owe their allegiance to the government, but instead they owe their allegiance to their commanders. And when they swear them in, they swear allegiance directly to their commanders. And this is because, as professional soldiers, the way that this system was set up, they were being paid for their services. But it wasn't the government who paid them. It wasn't the Senate who paid them. It was their generals who paid them. Thus, what we have is professional armies of soldiers who are loyal only to their generals rather than to the republic and the Senate and the government that they serve. So obviously, this creates something of a problem, because now any general that possesses enough wealth could fund his own army that would be loyal only to him. And the more battles that this general wins, and the more plunder that he gains, the more money he has, and the more money he can pay his soldiers, making them even more loyal to him. And so, with the strength of their own legions, generals could now use the military to take over the government. And we see Marius doing this exact same thing. And so Marius uses his position as general to gain an unprecedented 7 consecutive terms as consul, eventually coming to rule with practically absolute power. Yes, there was still a Senate, but this guy had so much power with the military behind him that he was able to do pretty much whatever he wanted and take out anybody who was getting in his way. And so he continued to rule in this fashion. That is, until he was challenged by another ambitious rival general with his own professionally paid legions. And that rival general was a man named Sulla. Marius and Sulla were political rivals for the consulship, and now the two waged war for control of Rome. A brutal civil war broke out between the two, and using his own professional armies, Sulla, and how ironic is this, he's using the very professional armies that Marius created, eventually laid siege to the city of Rome, defeated Marius in battle, and sent him into exile. Sulla then marched his armies into the city of Rome itself and began to order the murders of all who had supported Marius. So anybody who supported Marius, Sulla basically put out this hit list and was offering bounties to anybody who would kill those people. In Rome, they said that during this time of slaughter, there was so many killings, so much death, so much blood that you could have painted the side of houses with it. Marius, gone, exiled from the city, defeated, Sulla now has himself appointed dictator. And so thus we see Rome's original economic crisis has led to a new political and military crisis. The original economic crisis that undermined the real foundations of the Republic is now starting to see the old Republic slowly collapsing beneath its weight. We're seeing the transition from a government in which power generally rested with people who elected their leaders, now transitioning to one that is becoming much more absolute. Through economic crisis and attempted, quote, reforms, the system, already broken, is being made worse and becoming more of an absolute style government. The old Republic is indeed slowly collapsing. Eventually, Sulla dies, and that's when his dictatorship ends. But after Sulla's death, another great Roman general with professional armies at his back, a man named Gnaeus Pompey Magnus, would, like Sulla and like Marius before them, use the military to take over the government and become consul. And so the downward spiral of the Republic continues. Is it still technically a republic? Yeah, kind of, although the line is getting awfully blurry by this point in history. But we are very, very much near the point where we're going to become officially the Roman Empire. The Republic is crumbling and the downward spiral is continuing. All right, well, guys, we knew Rome was in bad economic and political and social shape, and in this session we took a look at some people who attempted reforms that may or may not have helped the situation at all. We met the Gracchus brothers, Tiberius and Gaius. Their attempted reforms to distribute land to the poor ended very badly, and ended more specifically with their own deaths. Then we met Gaius Marius, the politician and general. We saw him reform the military to provide more soldiers for the army and jobs for the poor, but ultimately, even though they saved Rome from outside invasion, these attempts at reform created more problems than they fixed, and Rome is now ever closer to the collapse of the Republic than they had yet been up to this point. Well, guys, those are the essential questions, and be prepared to discuss them the next time that we meet. And as always, until that time, I bid you farewell.